Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Breathe Easy Study, Health and Energy Impacts of Ventilation Improvements. I'm Jen Allen, Director at Waypoint Energy and a member of the Illinois Green Alliance Programs Committee. Today's webinar was put on by the Programs Committee, an Illinois Green volunteer group that coordinates educational events covering a wide range of topics. The team that put on today's events are myself, Anjana Dalal, Jim Tapor, and Elena Savana. Special thanks to the Illinois Institute of Technology for sponsoring today's content. You've all been muted upon entry, so please type any questions you have into the chat and we will get to them during the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent out in a follow-up email. The Illinois Green Alliance is a membership-driven nonprofit organization that advances green buildings and sustainable communities for all. Our recently launched 5-year strategic plan pushes the green building industry to meet or get on the path to net zero. We achieve this work through educational events such as panels and building tours, by engaging communities and partnering with organizations across Illinois, and by advocating for new policies and legislation. Members can view our recorded webinars on our on-demand webinar library, which is available on the website. Check out IGA's events and calendar and our Connect and Learn online page for upcoming webinars. Today, you'll be hearing from Brent Stevens, Insung Kang, and Anna McCreery. Dr. Brent Stevens is a professor and department chair in the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering at Illinois Institute of Technology. He's an expert in indoor air quality and building science with over 10 years of experience performing energy and indoor air quality field assessments and developing and applying models for energy use and costs, indoor air quality, and infectious disease transmission and human health. His work is grounded in practical applications and continues to influence professional practice, standards, and guidelines. Insung Kang is a PhD candidate in Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering at Illinois Institute of Technology, after earning his BS and ME in Architectural Engineering at Chang'an University in South Korea. His work primarily focuses on field measurements and data analysis for this project, working with Dr. Brent Stevens in the Built Environment Research Group. And Dr. Anna McCreery is a senior research manager at Elevate, a nonprofit organization dedicated to designing and implementing clean energy, water, and housing programs that lower costs and advance equity while addressing the climate crisis. As part of Elevate's research and innovation team, she has led research on residential hourly electricity pricing, housing and respiratory health, energy insecurity, and other topics. Previously, Anna was a researcher and instructor at Ohio State University in the Department of Sociology in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. She is published in Social Forces, Organization and the Environment, and the International Journal of Sustainability in Higher Education. I wanted to give a special thank you to our program sponsor, Illinois Institute of Technology. We really appreciate the support. And now I'd like to hand it over for a brief word from Dr. Brent Stevens.
All right, thank you for the quick introduction. We'll just give a brief introduction to our organizations. So if you're not familiar with Illinois Tech or Illinois Institute of Technology, we've been around since 1940 and actually date back to 1890 as the Armour Institute and the Lewis Institute when we merged. We're just on the south side of Chicago. You can see there our view of downtown. And we've got a number of undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs in engineering, of course, architecture, computer science, design, business, and more. So if you're interested in any of those programs, I'd encourage you to visit our website there. Next slide, please. Within the College of Engineering, I reside in the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering. Together with our colleagues in the College of Architecture, we form what I like to think of as kind of the architecture, engineering, and construction core here at Illinois Tech. So within our department, we have a number of bachelor's, master's, and PhD programs in civil engineering, architectural engineering. We're one of only about 20 accredited architectural engineering programs in the country. Environmental engineering, we've got master's programs in construction engineering, engineering management, energy systems engineering, structural engineering, and more. And we recently just started a joint master's program that is a hybrid of engineering and architecture with the College of Architecture called a Master of High Performance Buildings. So there's plenty of ways to get engaged. Some photos here show our kind of expertise in teaching and research across construction, building science, and more. Next slide. And then within the department, I co-run what I call the Built Environment Research Group, where we focus on energy and air quality within the built environment. So I got some links to my email address, our website there. I run this with my colleague, Dr. Mohammed Haider-Najad, who's an assistant professor of architectural engineering. And we have a number of field and lab facilities where we have these core research areas on indoor pollutant fate transport and control, air cleaning and filtration, building science and systems, human exposure and health impact assessment, and then of course the energy side, building energy efficiency and energy simulation. So that's just a little bit about us and what we do on a day-to-day basis, and a little bit about who we are. Next slide. And I'll turn that over to Elevate to introduce.
Yes, we can go ahead and move on to the next slide. I'm Anna McCreery. I'm on the research team at Elevate. We are a nonprofit who was born in and is based in Chicago, been around for about 20 years now, but we do work nationally. We have programs and partnerships across the country. Next slide. As a nonprofit, our mission is to create a world that addresses the climate crisis while advancing equity and ensuring that everybody has access to the resources and the health that they need to live their best lives, clean and affordable heat, power, and water in their homes and communities, no matter who they are. Next slide. We do that through a combination of program services and research and policy to help advance both the policy groundwork and gain the knowledge we need to make these things happen. We do energy efficiency and solar. We do water affordability as well as water safety, meaning lead being obviously the risk there. Healthy homes is a big part of what we do in all of those programs, as well as workforce and small business development programs to ensure that the economic situation is able to address these things, as well as advancing economic opportunity in communities that need it. We also do community planning for municipalities and states, as well as community resources and community education. We have our field outreach team there. And then policy, and my role as part of research and innovation, we partner with organizations like IIT on studies like this one. Next slide. So the core of what we're going to be talking about today is the Breathe Easy study. This has been a multi-year partnership between Elevate and IIT to examine the relationships and specific details related to both the health and energy impacts of different kinds of ventilation improvements in existing homes. Next slide. As some of the background, Elevate and of course IIT as well has been looking at healthy homes in a variety of different ways. At Elevate, this includes both program offerings and pilots, as well as studies like the Breathe Easy asthma study and an upcoming work that we're just in the early stages of that's taking a similar approach, examining air cleaners and their impact on COPD. That's also HUD funded. Next slide. As you may be aware, a big part of our health is exposure to indoor air pollutants in buildings. We spend vast majority of our time indoors, either in residential buildings, especially right now with COVID, or in office buildings and shops and other buildings. 90% of our time is in buildings where we're exposed to a variety of pollutants, many of which originate from inside homes or infiltrate into homes from outdoor air. There are estimates that around almost 3/4 of chemical exposure occurs during people's time indoors, with everything from combustion products, from cooking, from gas appliances, from other sources like candles, inadequate ventilation either in homes or in office buildings. Mold is a big source if there are water problems, as well as the actual building materials and products and furniture and things like that, which produce off-gassing. Next slide. One of the main ways that we would like to address these indoor air quality problems is, of course, you can reduce the sources. You can also ventilate and clear out the air by ensuring that cleaner air comes in from the outdoors, which often has lower concentrations of these toxic elements. Next slide. I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Brent to continue with the study basics.
All right, thank you for the handoff. So yeah, I'm happy to introduce our 3-year study that was a partnership between Elevate and Illinois Institute of Technology. We were initially funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development through what they call their Healthy Home Technical Study programs. We were one of several awarded back in 2016. It was a 3-year project focused on implementing residential mechanical ventilation. The overall sort of program objective is to gain knowledge to improve the efficacy and also evaluate the cost effectiveness of methods for evaluating and controlling housing-related health and safety hazards. So indoor air is a component of that. We were also co-funded. We were able to work with ComEd and their Emerging Technologies program to seek and obtain co-funding to kind of leverage some of the study, as we'll talk about in just a little bit. So we're thankful to our sponsors. Next slide. So the purpose of the study, it's the first known study that we're aware of that evaluated asthma outcomes and also indoor air quality for different types of mechanical ventilation systems. So if you're familiar with residential construction, you might be familiar with some of the different ways to ventilate homes, right? You can operate continuous, you can operate fans continuously or intermittently. You can operate exhaust fans, for example, bathroom fans that run all the time. You can turn it around and operate supply fans or systems that integrate with the existing furnace or central air handler to move air around the house. Part of what we did with the ComEd funding was leverage that to also install more energy efficient fan motors, so that when you're operating the fan, it uses less energy when we do that. And then there's also kind of a combined system, a balanced combined supply and exhaust system, which can be combined with an energy recovery ventilator, which is what we did. And so we've got these kind of three main categories of systems. I'll show you an image of that in just a moment. And what we did is we sized these homes that were recruited to, we sized the ventilation systems in these homes according to the most recent ASHRAE standard 62.2 requirements at the time. And the overall goal of the study is to provide guidance to homeowners, to contractors, to builders, and of course agencies such as HUD on the advantages and disadvantages of different types of residential mechanical ventilations for impacting both indoor air quality and asthma outcomes. Next slide, please. So the study details are that we installed 3 different types of ventilation systems to meet ASHRAE standard 62.2 requirements for airflow rates. We also installed these electronically commutated motors, energy efficient fan motors, in the central air handlers in all the feasible homes that we could. It's a 3-year study that was divided basically into 2 main components. Year 1 was pre-intervention, where we measured indoor air quality on a rotating basis, and we also measured or assessed via survey asthma outcomes, asthma symptom scores. Then we intervened, we installed the ventilation systems, and then we measured again those same variables for a whole nother year. That allowed us to evaluate the impacts of the intervention broadly, as well as across the different types of ventilation systems. We could also assess the real world cost of installation because these were installed by contractors. Also, it allowed us to evaluate the efficacy and cost of upgrading to energy efficient furnace motors, ECM motors, in tandem with ventilation system upgrades. Which gives us a chance to kind of combine energy and indoor air quality or health motivations. Next slide, please. So here's just kind of a simple diagram, relatively simple diagram of the 3 main types of ventilation systems that we installed. On the top left is kind of a simple system you can envision. We targeted about 45 homes. We ended up with about 40 homes at the end of the day. So 13, and we tried to divide them evenly into groups of 3. Didn't quite work out, but it got close. And so type 1 is continuous exhaust only. You can just envision this as new bathroom fans that operate all the time, sized to meet ASHRAE standard 62.2. Broadly, puts the building under slight negative pressure, so air comes in through leaks and gaps in the building envelope and is exhausted through usually 2 bathroom fans, depending on the size of the house. Type 2 is an intermittent system and a central fan integrated supply system. There's a lot of kind of funny terminology around residential ventilation, but this is a fairly commonly used approach, CFIS, and on an intermittent basis. So what this does is bring outdoor air in from a known source, ducted typically to the roof line or through the wall, brings that into the air handler, and then pushes air, through the air handler, whatever filters installed there, into the house. So it slightly positively pressurizes the house, but it does so on an intermittent basis. So it just comes on and off with the heating and cooling system. And if the heating and cooling system didn't run, well, then a powered ventilator operated and turned the system on to operate somewhere around 1/3 of the time. And then type 3 is a continuous balance supply and exhaust system with an ERV. So most of these were independently ducted, so a little bit heavier construction. An energy recovery ventilator was installed to pull air in from the outside and also exhaust air from the inside and pass that through this recovery ventilator to save energy so it reduces some of the load, the extra ventilation, heating, and cooling load. This was typically done, like I said, in a fully ducted fashion with usually with some kind of light construction in the interior of the house, usually with one inlet, one outlet. And a few homes, this was also integrated with the central system because it was the only way to do it. And then especially in the CFIS homes, and then in some of the type 3 continuous homes, we were able to replace, again, the fan motors with these ECM motors to try to save energy and evaluate that. Next slide, please. So moving on into data collection. Remember I mentioned we did data collection for a year without any intervention and then for another year with the intervention. Our data collection included asthma outcomes. So we recruited participants, adult participants with asthma, self-reported asthma. And we had them complete a monthly asthma survey using a validated survey instrument called the Asthma Control Test. We'll learn more about that, but it gives us a score essentially of how well controlled their asthma is. And you can look at it in a couple different ways. And then on a rotating basis throughout the whole 2-year study, each home was measured for 2 years, but they're kind of lagged in recruitment. So the whole time took almost 3 years. We made measurements of indoor and outdoor air quality. So on the right, you see these pictures of our instrument cases that we used to house all of our instruments. On the top is the indoor instrument case, and on the bottom is the outdoor instrument case. It was essentially like a deck box where you would put pillows and so forth that we could lock, plug in, and leave outside. Amazingly, none were stolen throughout this whole 2-year study. So that was great. Stolen, lost, or broken. And so this rotating set of measurements occurred in these 8-week-long periods of indoor and outdoor air quality testing. So 4 quarterly or seasonal measurements where we launched the equipment to monitor for about a week at a time. We had several of these boxes, so we could do about 4 houses at a time and just rotate from home to home. So I have this rotating monitoring, 4 seasonal or quarterly visits before the ventilation system, and then 4 again after the ventilation system. So it allowed us to get multiple data points in time in the same homes with and without ventilation. Our monitoring equipment included a kind of a simple measure of formaldehyde as a primarily indoor source pollutant. Carbon monoxide, also a relatively simple measure there. Carbon dioxide as an indicator of both occupancy and ventilation. And then we also measured a real-time nitrogen dioxide, NO2, ozone, and size-resolved particulate matter. These were, again, measured both inside and outside at the same time so that you could always adjust your indoor readings for your outdoor readings at the same time. And the point here is that we could talk about this more, but just the very selection of what type of equipment to utilize was not trivial. We had a number of calibration issues and data processing efforts that just aren't trivial if you want to try to do this. And then next slide, I just have a few photos of us in the field. On the left, there I am with Dr. Parham Azimi, who's now a postdoc at the Harvard School of Public Health. He worked on this project for a couple of years before he left IIT, carting our boxes around, Insung there, installing one in the hallway. And then what I didn't tell you is we also had a number of HVAC type of operational measurements kind of hidden throughout the house. So we also installed plug load data loggers to measure how the ventilation systems operated in the mechanical rooms, to see how often they were operating and how much power they used. We also installed runtime monitors for the exhaust fans. These are little anemometers that we would hang for the week to measure how often people use their exhaust fans in the bathroom. Same sort of thing, same type of monitor as well on a HVAC system. So we would measure how often the central furnace or air conditioning unit, the air handler operated. And in the middle picture there, we've got an exhaust fan flow measure. So we also measured the flow rates of the exhaust fans, as well as any of the other supply ventilation systems that we installed. So we've got a number of kind of HVAC characteristics as well as the air tightness of the home and other types of kind of housing condition type assessment. All right, next slide, and I'll turn that back to Anna.
Yes, just wanted to take a few moments and talk about our study homes. We did recruitment. Actually, I wanted to thank the Chicago Bungalow Association, who was instrumental in our recruitment. The majority of our homes, you can see here, 68% were actually iconic historic Chicago bungalows, which meant we had a very consistent home type for the study. It was very beneficial for consistency there. We initially recruited 40 homes at the initial stage of the study, of which 40 completed the study over an approximately 2-year period. About a third of them were weatherized in the years leading up to the study, and almost 80% had pre-existing health and safety issues of various kinds, such as improperly vented combustion appliances, which we would have, many of which we would have fixed during the construction phase, mold or dampness issues, which unfortunately there wasn't funding in the study to fix major construction issues like that, as well as things that are less relevant for indoor air quality, like chipping paint, tripping hazards, and things like that. Next slide. In terms of the actual installation process, we're going to talk a little bit about that because this is also sort of a non-trivial part of the study here. Next slide. So in terms of these 3 different ventilation systems that we installed, the intention was to install them sort of pseudo-randomly, as randomized as possible. However, in reality on the ground, a lot of times you can't install a particular ventilation system in a given home. So for example, if a home has an existing potential health and safety risk and needs to be pressurized, that would mean that we'd install a ventilation system to pressurize it, meaning group 2, the supply, what would be selected in that case. Other homes maybe didn't have a central air handler, in which case they would most likely get, in some cases, bathroom fans or potentially an ERV with standalone ductwork. In other cases, there might not be space for an ERV in the utility mechanical supply closet area. They're physically quite large, in which case we'd have to select one of the other systems for those homes. So in the end, although the intention was to be a little bit pseudo-randomized there, we did have final determination of the ventilation system assignments was made by the installation contractors, in many cases of their recommendations. The final breakdown of the ventilation systems groups was an approximately even split, or close to even split, between the 3 here. We had 13 receiving exhaust-only bathroom fans, 15 receiving the central fan integrated supply system, and 12 receiving the balance system with an energy recovery ventilator. You can also see here the majority of the CFIS systems did receive an electrically commutated furnace motor replacement. Next slide. In terms of the actual installation experiences, we wanted to provide a few notes about what kind of skills are necessary for the contractors doing this kind of work. And one of the big lessons was actually the importance of homeowner education and customer service skills. Those were pretty critical in this. There was quite a lot of work involved in both scheduling the actual appointments to make these installations, as well as guiding homeowners through the process. You know, a lot of times we get calls about, oh, it's colder in here, I wasn't expecting that, or whatever the issues might be. We'd have to talk through the homeowner, say, yes, you might experience a little bit of a temperature variation. We might need to tweak the ventilation system after the fact. We did need to have nine follow-up visits in these homes to address minor issues or make minor adjustments to the ventilation systems while still maintaining ASHRAE 62.2 standards for airflow rates. There was also one actually substantial issue in one of the homes. This was the 41st home that dropped out of the study, the last home to drop out. There was an installation error with the ductwork where they had an ERV, which is intended to bring tempered air into the home instead of unconditioned, untempered outdoor air. However, because of the alignment with the ductwork misalignment issue, there was a significant amount of unconditioned, untempered air being brought directly into the living space. And unfortunately, the homeowner didn't tell us until several months later, actually turned off the ventilation system and eventually just withdrew from the study. And I mentioned this not to talk about this in a negative light, but just to highlight that these things are not trivial. The installation process, and it is very important to both guide the homeowner through the experience and potential changes that they might notice in their homes, as well as ensuring that the right skills and the right follow-up is in place to make sure that everybody has a good experience. Next slide. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Brent for these next few slides here.
All right, and so just to kind of finish up the study details before we get into the results, I think it's useful to see some images from the construction process and what came of it. And so first and foremost, I want to thank Nick and Eddie Construction, who we contracted to do this work. So on the left, you've got kind of an example bathroom exhaust fan. On the right, an example of a penetration made to the outside of the envelope. So a little bit of light construction, if you will, to exhaust to the outside. On the far right, you've got some interior construction that was done to install a fully ducted system, meaning an independently ducted, I guess is the better term for it, an independently ducted ERV system with an inlet and an outlet. So that required a little bit more invasiveness, although even some of the exhaust fans required some relatively invasive construction. Also important to point out is that this study was not possible without donations from a number of manufacturers. And so we had manufacturer donations of all of our bath fans, our powered ventilator fans, our energy recovery ventilators came from 4 different manufacturers. Broan, Panasonic, Renew Air, and April Air were all generous in donating this equipment. Next slide, please. And then here's just another example of kind of the higher level of construction required for an energy recovery ventilator to be installed. On the left, you've just got an example of one of these in the basement of a home with ductwork running around. And then again, penetrations on the right there for both inlets and outlets. I want to also mention that one last study detail is that every home that had a central air handling unit at the intervention stage also got improved to MERV 10 central filtration if they had worse than MERV 10 to begin with. If they have better, we let them keep their better filters. But this was also achievable with a donation from Tex Air Filters, an industry colleague who provided these MERV 10 filters of a bunch of different sizes that could fit within these systems. Okay, so that's it for study details. Let's go on to the next slide, and I'll hand it over to Insung Kang, who will talk about the results and the analysis.
All right, finally my turn. I'm going to briefly talk about 3 main results of the study. Firstly, we look at the associations between indoor air quality, demographics, and asthma control during the pre-intervention period, so without any impacts of ventilation system. Next, please. To quote statistical data from the CDC and the National Health Interview Survey, there has been asthma disparity based on complex factors. For example, differences between age, gender, race, and socioeconomic status. In our data set with 51 participants, we've also found statistically significant relationships between demographics and their asthma severity. First, low-income group had about 94% higher odds of having poorly controlled asthma compared to higher income group. And African American group showed more than 4 times higher risk of having poorly controlled asthma compared to white group. This corresponds to the fact that the prevalence of asthma is highest among African Americans, among about 20 million US asthmatic adults. Next, please. We've also figured out that NO2 levels were significantly higher in poorly controlled group than well-controlled group. So we could conclude gas stoves or home appliances which emit NO2 may exacerbate asthma symptoms. We are still working on further analysis related to other indoor environmental factors such as mold, dampness, and musty smells. Next, please. Now let's see how our Bridge project worked successfully improving asthma and IAQ. Next, please. Here, the upper graph shows participant distribution of uncontrolled and partially controlled and well-controlled asthma at each pre and post-intervention period. And the histograms below are asthma control score distributions at pre and post-intervention. As expected, more participants tend to respond higher ACT score after they got the new ventilation system. Next, please. And this time, we've got the box plus of ACT score by ventilation system type. We can also see that adding ventilation systems, regardless of their system type, improve the asthma control with a strong statistical significance. And when it comes to separate system type, each system also shows a statistically significant improvement on asthma control with a p-value less than 0.05. Next, please. And as we mentioned earlier, since we measured both indoor and outdoor pollutants simultaneously, we could easily calculate indoor to outdoor ratios. This graph shows the IO ratios at pre and post intervention periods. And we can see that CO2 and NO2 and particulate matters PM1, PM2.5, and PM10 were significantly reduced from both indoor and outdoor sources. Especially, it should be noted that IO ratios of particles decreased about 30 to 40%, which is pretty impressive. Next, please. And when we look at these IO ratio reductions by ventilation system type, the balanced system with an ERV shows the best performance for reducing CO2, NO2, and particles when I used Wilcoxon's sign rank test. However, if you look at the CFI system, even though the mean values were reduced after intervention, statistics says there were no significant impacts. Next, please. Lastly, we also analyzed energy and cost of ventilation system. Next, please. This graph here is the total 10-year cost of each ventilation system retrofit. And we've got the initial costs, including upfront, retail price, and installation costs from the vendors, colored as grays. And orange and yellow boxes, we calculated fan energy costs and additional heating and cooling energy costs too. The detailed calculations are in appendix. The balance system cost highest due to the high initial cost. And although a lot of energy could be saved from the ERV, on the other hand, the CFI system was lowest with small initial cost and somewhat low energy from intermittent operation. And a large amount of heating and cooling energy was required in exhaust-only system. We are still working on life cycle cost analysis, including IAQ and health benefits, and also working on publishing papers. So hope you guys please stay tuned. Next, please. Lastly, here we evaluate the energy efficacy of ECM motors, as Dr. Stevens mentioned earlier. And we estimated annual energy use by multiplying power draw and system runtime, both from our field measurements. As you can see in the graph, more than half of the energy could be saved from ECM motor. And of course, these impacts will be considered in life cycle cost analysis. Next, please. Our turn, back to Dr. Stevens.
Okay, thank you, Insung. So I've just got a couple of slides to talk about some of the study limitations, of which there are several. Next slide, please. So number one, even we started with 45 homes, narrowed down to 40 with some attrition. It's still a pretty small sample size. So this kind of affects, the levels of statistical significance, and it's just a limitation of the study that we couldn't really get around because of the level of effort required to do even just those 40 homes. So there's that. Also, with the size of the study, we were not able to actually have a parallel control group. So asthma control could have gotten a little bit better in a control group or something like that. And we just don't have that information. We did have a little bit of limitations due to COVID, but fortunately not an enormous amount. Our field measurements ended at about 90% complete. We missed about 20 of our final home visits because of the shelter-in-place order, and we just never recovered from that. Otherwise, our field campaign was quite successful. We did have another limitation of relying on self-reported participant asthma outcomes and information on some of their home characteristics that we got through survey. So there's some potential for recall bias and so forth. We have some potential issues in some of the monitoring equipment for indoor and outdoor air quality. We were, sort of limited in budget, but wanted to measure a number of constituents. And so some of those are not the highest possible quality, such as it is. Measuring indoor and outdoor concentrations at the same time helps alleviate that because you're always anchoring. And we did quarterly calibration processes, but they weren't perfect. And we also had a few missing data points that we unfortunately we're not able to get pre and post fan change out on the power draw of those ECM motors and the prior permanent split capacitor motors, PSC motors. So we had to kind of draw on the literature a little bit, which we know, the differences broadly in kind of fan efficiency, but we didn't have great measurements of those, unfortunately. So a number of limitations, but they are what they are. And with that, let me turn it back over to Anna, who can, I believe, close us out.
Yeah, so we just have a few conclusions and recommendations based on our results here, and then we can move on to questions. So the first is that as expected, asthma severity is indeed worse among Black and low-income participants, and this is consistent with broader inequities in terms of the social determinants of health. We also did, unsurprisingly, find that better indoor air quality is associated with improved asthma control. No surprises there. In terms of the ventilation systems themselves, again, we found that consistent with the broader research, mechanical ventilation does tend to improve asthma control and indoor air quality. In this case, we found that the balanced system with an ERV is associated with the largest improvements in indoor air quality. However, there was no similarly consistent result in terms of asthma control. One of the possible limitations in our statistical analysis is that with a small sample size, some effects that might be real in the real world might not show up as statistically significant. So take from that what you will. Regardless, we did find that in general, there is a significant effect on improved asthma control across the three system types. And in general, it's therefore beneficial to add ventilation in homes, especially with people with asthma. In terms of life cycle cost analysis, that is ongoing, but you can see there are already some sort of trending cost numbers that we can see here. Informally, we would refer to that balance system with an ERV as our Cadillac ventilation system. It's a bit pricier, a bit bigger, and you can see that in the effects, although you don't have to spend more money to get a good outcome here. And finally, in terms of the process, homeowner education, contractor training, and post-installation quality control are a big, important part of the process for ensuring good outcomes for people. Next slide. So in terms of our recommendations, we do recommend that because when you're doing energy efficiency, you're already in somebody's home, you're tightening up the home envelope, you're air sealing, you may end up reducing air exchange rates with the outdoors. That's a good thing for efficiency, but it can have negative health impacts. So we recommend looking at ways that energy efficiency programs and weatherization programs could consider adding mechanical ventilation to help mitigate those air pollutants from indoor sources and generally improve indoor air quality in weatherized homes. And the second piece of that is that you're in the home already, you might as well improve those non-energy benefits at the same time as you're improving the energy efficiency of the home itself. So especially for vulnerable residents with asthma or with other respiratory challenges or in homes that have significant health and safety issues, those non-energy benefits can be really huge and be significant. And a combined program can take advantage of that while also finding ways to help people see the benefits of energy efficiency outside of just energy itself. Next slide. And finally, we do recommend that workforce development consider the ways that we can train our contractor base and have a workforce that is effective at those pieces that are most essential for this kind of work. So of course you need your technical skills, your HVAC, your plumbing, all of that going on. You also need contractors that can help guide homeowners through the process, that can reassure people, yes, that is operating how it's supposed to. You might see some changes. Here are the benefits despite that, those changes that you might experience, even if it feels a little bit drafty, the benefits to your health can outweigh that. People can get used to it. We actually found that they did get used to it, and there was greater satisfaction with ventilation systems over time. We didn't include that here though. And finally, ensuring that contractors have the systems in place for post-install quality control are all important for ensuring that people have a good experience through these processes. Again, I can't stress that enough, homeowner education. We have all been educated on the importance of indoor air quality and ventilation in the time of COVID. We've all understood that these are critical, especially right now. We've seen how ventilation can help reduce the risk of COVID as well. So this is sort of an ideal time to capitalize on that unfortunate education we've all had to experience. But it's a great time to really push for improvements that can be beneficial in a number of different ways, including reducing the risk of COVID transmission, as well as receiving these other health benefits. And if we combine it with energy efficiency improvements like weatherization and those ECM furnace motors, we can really get a lot for our buck there. And finally, by educating homeowners on the benefits of ventilation, that can also be a way to get into a home and encourage energy efficiency and expand the reach of our existing programs. Next slide. That is all that we have here. We have our contact information here, as well as Amanda Gramigna, who was another instrumental person on the program on the Elevate side. And I will open it up now for questions, which all of us can answer. Brent and Insung, you can feel free to join in the discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Anna. So just going through the questions that we have here, a few did come in throughout the presentation, so I'm just going to go one at a time. So the first question is, did any homes have more than one ventilation system installed, and then compare those systems across the same home and occupants during year 2?
I'll take that. No, all but one home had essentially no baseline mechanical ventilation. There's one home that had that was newer, had some exhaust fans. I think 2 of 4 were operating continuously. So even at baseline, that it wasn't a fully mechanically ventilated home.
Gotcha. Thanks. Second question is, any monitoring of kitchen ventilation operation and assessment if ducted outside or recirculated?
I'll take that one too. It's a great question. Unfortunately, no monitoring of the ventilation, the range hood operation. Insung, we were able to gather, or Anna, we were able to gather data on what we think, whether it exhausted to the outside or not, right? The range hood.
I'm not sure that we did. We did gather data on electric versus gas stove, which I know is a component of this, not the only component or even necessarily the most important component. Insung, is it? Am I misremembering?
Yeah. As far as no, I think during the first initial assessments, field measurements, Dr. Parham Azimi and other staff visit the homes to check whether the ventilation, the range hoods was ventilated to outside or not. So I have yes or no data for them.
Yeah, we have, I'm sorry, I don't have the direct answer to that. I know it was a challenge to figure out some of them. We have flow measurements. We have records of those. And I'm pretty positive that those flows are to the outside, although sometimes it was hard to tell. And then we have a lot of photos that we need to mine in a little bit more detail. But I think it's an imperfect measure. It's a good question.
Yeah. In general, I would assume that a reasonable proportion are recirculating because it just tends to be common in the housing stock here.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Next question is, how were the parameters selected for indoor air quality measurement? Did parameters chosen relate to human health, specifically respiratory concerns?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. A couple of factors, but yes, driven by human health concerns. So particles, NO2, ozone, those have all been shown in the literature, especially with outdoor air, less so with indoor air, just because we study indoor air a lot less. Those have all been shown to be associated with asthma development, exacerbation, and so on. So those were kind of mechanistically thoughtful. They were also chosen for kind of a combination of 2 other factors. One was as leading indicators of indoor or outdoor origin pollutants, or both. So particles come in from inside and from outside, right? So that's kind of like a both ways. Ozone is primarily only from outside, so that's a nice measure of outdoors. NO2 is from combustion indoors and also from outside, so it's kind of both ways. Our formaldehyde and CO2 measures are really more indicators of indoor sources. So it allowed us to kind of look at this matrix of indoor and outdoor sources, or both. And then the last consideration is just practicality and sort of mechanism, like what would we expect ventilation to impact? Yeah.
Great. Next question is, how can we identify the source of VOCs and reduce TVOC in the space, and what are the simulation tools that can help?
I have
Talk a
thoughts.
little bit about sources, a variety of different sources of VOCs, from everything from shower curtains to furniture. It's really comprehensive and broad how many different sources there are in our lives. I would say that actually eliminating them from the sources is going to be pretty tricky unless you're willing to spend a lot of money on specialty or so-called natural products.
That's helpful. Thanks, Anna.
And I'll just mention for those on the call, because I know that there's sort of I find myself in an academic pinch point all the time when people want to say, hey, I want to measure and assess my indoor air. And I want to say, here's how you do it. But what I have to say is, well, it's complicated. What are you interested in? If you're just interested in VOCs alone and you want to do it right, we would have spent all of our money on VOC measurements and not gotten any of these other indicators. So it's a real challenge. TVOCs, total volatile organic compound monitors, like PIDs, photoionization detectors, are useful as a gross measure of TVOC. But, you know, the good ones are $8,000 a pop, and we couldn't get 4 of those and rotate them around. It just wasn't worth it to us. Otherwise, you got to use integrated samplers or really even more expensive equipment that's not very mobile. So it's all kind of I wouldn't say optimization, but it's how do you do the best you can with what you got.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, you know, what would be like the worst offender to pinpoint if somebody were to start considering their indoor air quality? I'm sure you get that question all the time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I'd say it depends.
It depends. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I would also say I would worry less about worst offenders and more about easiest things you could do, concrete actions. So cooking might be one of the biggest offenders in terms of indoor air quality, both particulate matter and, depending on the stove equipment, potentially NO2 or other sources. But we need to eat, and we need to eat healthy, and sometimes that means we need to cook. It might be simpler and easier to cut out these scented candles.
Mm-hmm.
Or things like that, or even just open your windows more, depending on where you're living.
Makes sense. Thanks. Okay, next question here is for Dr. Stevens. How much does external factors, smoking, cooking practices in different houses, do you think affected the results regarding indoor air quality and indoor pollutants? So somewhat similar to the last question, but slightly different.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Good to see you. So they were all non-smoking or self-declared non-smoking homes, and we didn't detect any, presence of smoke or secondhand smoke or third-hand smoke on our visits. So that shouldn't be a big deal. Don't know much about behaviors. I think also the bigger picture is that, the indoor air and the handful of constituents that we measured, with limitations and all, are probably not the only factors that influence, asthma symptoms. So I think we're trying to look at a very narrow subset, right? There's lots of other behavioral and other types of factors that could be important. So I think that's just kind of part of the limitation of trying to study a small slice. Not everything with an asthma exacerbation is environmentally driven, and certainly isn't all just those constituents that we measured.
Mm-hmm. Next question is, were the statistically significant NO2 impact on asthma from gas ranges measured in the kitchen area and tied to operation of the range and or exhaust hood? This is one of Insung's first slides.
Insung, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that. So every indoor air quality measurements were conducted in bedroom or living room. So I cannot say the NO2 was directly came from the cooking or other combustion sources. So, but we just assume the NO2 levels were significant. Mostly came from indoor sources, which is cooking.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't show it here, but you also included that as one of your factors in your regression model, right? as a modifier, like whether it had a stove or not. We don't show the results. I don't know if we have it in the appendix. We haven't finished the entirety of the health impact analysis. So regardless, we'll be sure to include that as a modifier.
Awesome.
No, we don't have that result in the appendix for today's presentation.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, maybe we can send that out in the follow-up email if it's available. And if not, we can always follow up later. Thanks. Okay, next question here is, what considerations were taken into account in terms of home enclosure air tightness? Any considerations for control of makeup air location for exhaust-only systems?
Yeah, I can take that, Al. Good to see you, Al. So it's a very good question. So the question is basically, how do we account for existing infiltration or leakiness of the homes? We thought long and hard about it until we realized we need to not think so hard about it. The issue was, we thought, well, should we calculate 62.2 required rates and then subtract the average annual infiltration? Like, so could you get an infiltration credit? And it turns out that all these homes were old enough and leaky enough that if we had applied the infiltration credit, we would have never given them ventilation. And so the way I started to look at it was 62.2, remember, it's a minimum standard. And so if you calculate an air change rate, an average annual air change rate on kind of a standard house meeting 62.2, it only adds about 0.3 air changes per hour or so on average to the baseline. And from studies in the literature that motivated this study from the UK and Canada primarily, we realized that that's a pretty small difference. Let's just put it on top of infiltration. Because a lot of those studies kind of came from the public health community and didn't really even include air tightness. So we thought, you know what, let's go with the assumption or the expectation that more ventilation is better. And therefore it was all additive. We do have blower door measurements for most of these homes, almost all of the homes. But very good question. So in the end, they were leaky enough that we didn't need to do much more.
Great. Next question is, would a study like this be conducted on a multi-family housing structure? Or could it?
I'd love to do that. There's also another question, what concerns do you have with extrapolating these results to multifamily housing situations? I would say the level of complexity would be increased substantially in terms of both of those questions.
That would make sense.
Yeah, and then you could get into like, if the idea is how do you mechanically ventilate, you'd probably have to do a cross section of buildings, right? Where a couple of multifamily large buildings are, whatever, positive pressure hallway ventilation, and others are another, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I would also say the type of building is likely to make a significant difference. In Chicago, we have a lot of 2 to 4 unit buildings, stacked 2 flats. We call them 2 flats, even if they have 4 units in them. The smaller ones might function a little bit closer to like a single family. And certainly sometimes people convert them into single families, in which case that's very different than a 30-story large commercial building situation.
Next question is, while measurement, the other air properties, including thermostats, RHs, which can have an impact on mechanical airflow, were also controlled. I'm not sure if I understand that question, but I'm hoping you do. While measuring, the other air properties included thermostats.
We did measure a variety of temperature and humidity related conditions as part of the data collection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one thought that comes to mind, I'm trying to answer that, is that the CFIS systems, the powered ventilator, because they deliver untempered air, which we were skeptical of, by the way, in this climate, but we consulted with the manufacturers across the board, and they're like, it doesn't, it works for us, and it minimizes the cost and so on. So we went a lot with manufacturer recommendations, even if we were like, are you sure about that? But those had temperature cutoffs. So they would not operate when it was too hot. They would not operate when it was too cold. So even if they were set to run 15 or 20 minutes out of every hour, for example, using a timer, sometimes they didn't even run that much because it was just too cold, for a week at a time or what have you. So those impact especially the intermittent operation and to a lesser extent the ERV operation.
One thing to follow up to Brent's comment is, one of our hypotheses is whether the ventilation system can maintain the temperature and relative humidity indoors. We had a data that, all of the system were able to maintain the indoor environmental conditions appropriately. But I don't have the result in today's presentation.
Yeah, we did have some initial homeowner concerns expressed about temperature, especially for those winter installations. We were doing ventilation system installations from sort of November-ish to May. It took a while, but the ones in the middle of winter, we definitely had phone calls about, hey, it's colder in here. And a few of them led to follow-up visits and in some cases tweaks to systems. I think there were a few where we changed it from running CFS from running 20 minutes out of every hour to 15 minutes or something like that. And this is despite, temperature staying reasonably consistent. It's just, it feels a bit draftier and colder. So that was definitely an issue and something we had to work with homeowners on.
Got it, thanks. Next question. With HCBA helping with recruitment, presumably all homes follow the standard Chicago lot design of having detached garages, but can you confirm that?
It's a good question. My guess is probably, but Brent?
Yeah, I'm thinking of every home I visited, I believe, had a detached garage. I don't know that we've summarized that. We need to. Thank you for the idea.
Good idea.
Good question. And then we actually have a handful of other questions here in the chat, so I'm just going to quickly go through these. We have a few minutes. Did you attempt MERV 13 with existing fan motors?
Yeah, we didn't try that. We worked with our filter manufacturer to find like MERV 10 media. We just didn't want to kind of add in this potential new problem, although it could be a potential solution. So we try to find these we got this like MERV 10 media that was also electrostatically charged media, not an active thing, but a passive electric charge. And we replaced them every 90 days. So the charge probably didn't get used up too much. And so they were kind of MERV 10 1-inch filters. So they were, minimal impacts on the air handlers.
Yeah, we did consider some of the higher MERV filters, but in the end, decided not to risk breaking people's furnaces.
Yeah.
Control how old the furnaces are.
And if you're interested, Susan, if you're interested in that, we've done some other measurements for another study. I'd be happy to tell you kind of more about what we found there practically. Essentially, with a little bit more customization, you could put in an extended depth MERV 13 filter, and those don't have much pressure drop at all. But if you try to squeeze it all into a 1-inch filter, that's where you get pressure drop issues. My master's work was on pressure drop implications of better filters. So we could talk offline on that.
That's great. These are wonderful questions. Thank you to everyone in the audience for participating and for your thoughtful questions. I guess that is all that we have. I know that we're at the top of the hour, so just wanted to check in with Ashley. Is there anything else that we wanted to mention? I know we will be recording this and sending it out as a follow-up.
Yeah, and any questions we didn't get to, we can send out to the panelists to have them answer and send that in the follow-up email.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our speakers and again to IIT for sponsoring today's content. We really appreciate it. It was a great session and we'll look forward to the next one. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you for the opportunity and for everyone coming.
Yes, thank you, Illinois Green, for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Art.
All right. Bye, everyone.